The PlayStation 1 and Nintendo 64 were essentially polar opposites during the 5th console generation. At least, that's what Sony's marketing tried to tell us. In this video, I've decided to compare 34 games, 17 PlayStation and 17 Nintendo 64 ones. I've picked out the racing game genre as it was plentiful in both systems. I'll be covering proper racing games only though, so no karts and stuff. This video has 3 goals. Firstly, I want to compare a few racing games directly. May they be ports, competitors in the same franchise, or the first racing games you could get your hands on both systems. Secondly, as not all games were available all the time during the 90s, as there was no huge digital store to just buy any game you wanted from it, those 4,000 PS1 and 388 Nintendo 64 games, yeah, not only were they not present in every region of the world, but they also weren't present in every store. Because of this, I wanted to pair up some games that came out at around the same time and looked similar enough. Thirdly, I want to compare the visual differences between these games, graphically, as the PlayStation 1 and Nintendo 64 were fundamentally different consoles. Let's get into it. Ridge Racer and Cruis'n USA were basically the first PlayStation 1 and Nintendo 64 racing games, even though Ridge Racer came out almost 2 years earlier. Even so, the difference between these two games is very interesting. Ridge Racer tries to go for a more realistic, but limited environment in a lot of areas. Even so, it attempts to keep it detailed, varied, and pretty realistic. In comparison, Cruis'n USA puts a lot more emphasis on the track itself, and because of that, it feels like you're driving on a track floating in a void with repeating 2D trees on the side of the road, and you can even see the clear edges where the world ends and space begins. It feels like you're racing down a really long dam. Because of this far less realistic art style, and because overall, it just feels a lot less like a cohesive world, personally, I'm giving a point to Ridge Racer. Ridge Racer Revolution also came out 2 years before MRC Multi-Racing Championship. And the story is actually not the same as last time. RRR is an updated version of Ridge Racer on a new track, and that means the engine itself has a few improvements. The game looks, well, better in a few spots, though the main difference we can really notice is how much more detailed the near-water environment is. MRC, on the other hand, is, well, I mean, look at it. It's going for a far more realistic style, though I feel the camera's FOV is far too small to give you a proper feel for the space you're driving in. WipEout XL released 2 years before WipEout 64, and WipEout 64 is sort of considered a sequel to XL, lore-wise. They're graphically both quite on par with each other. It really just depends if you wanted the more sharp PS1 visuals or the more moody Nintendo 64 ones. Both get a point here. Need for Speed released a year before F1 Pole Position 64, and both games show off some pretty interesting environments. Due to the way the Need for Speed track design is, the game looks like it has a bit of a graphical edge over the simple, flat track design of Pole Position. Need for Speed 2 and Cruis'n World both released in the same year, and they both don't look that good, honestly. Need for Speed 2's world seems really disconnected, and the flat-looking desert areas look far worse than its city areas. Cruis'n World is a far more cohesive and visually appealing game than the last one, and that really helps the game sell you on the idea that you're racing on a real racetrack, and not just above some big void. Need for Speed V-Rally and Top Gear Rally both released in the same year. Top Gear Rally has some really detailed environments, at least for a 1997 PS1 game. Top Gear Rally is, well, muddy. Very muddy. It has a lot less detail than something like V-Rally. Even so, the render distance in this game is actually pretty decent, though right now you can't see most of it due to the fog. Colin Mcrae Rally released a year before Beetle Adventure Racing. Colin Mcrae Rally tries really hard to make a good-looking vehicle and track environment, and it succeeds in doing so. The car looks great and has a damage model, the track itself looks good, and the track environment around it looks mostly decent. It gives you a great illusion that this is an actually cohesive world you're driving around. Beetle Adventure Racing fights back and actually uses the muddiness of the Nintendo 64 to great effect, creating some very realistic textures and environments for you to drive around in. This muddiness lets the developers use the 2D trees above the track, and it makes them far more convincing. It also sells you on a real 3D environment, just as well as Colin Mcrae Rally does. Gran Turismo released a year before GT64 Championship Edition. GT's draw distance isn't particularly amazing, but it manages to shove a lot of detail into the small tracks, while also featuring some very realistic looking vehicles. GT64 does the same, and while the game does look quite nice, the frame rate is very much so not ideal. You can get used to it, but it's very jarring to go from the 30 FPS smoothish frame rate of most racing games, including GT, to the 15 FPS frame rate of GT64. Need for Speed 3 released a year after Automobili Lamborghini. Need for Speed 3 has some pretty detailed environments and an uncapped frame rate. The N64's frame rate had to be clamped to a number that could clearly divide by 60, but the PS1 had no such issues. Because of that, while the frame rate of Need for Speed 3 targets 30 FPS, it can sometimes go over 40, but of course also in some cases it can drop down to around 25. Automobili Lamborghini does its best to obscure its draw distance, and honestly the camera angle doesn't do the good-looking car models enough justice. It uses the graphical style of the Nintendo 64 quite well, and shockingly, the guys who made this game, Titus, also made Superman 64. Ah yes, the Battle of the Ridge Racers. Ridge Racer Type 4 released a whole 2 years before Ridge Racer 64. Ridge Racer Type 4 could honestly be mistaken for an early PS2 game, or PSP game. It just looks so good, the environments are detailed, the lighting is absurdly well done, the car models are really detailed. What is there not to love? Ridge Racer 64 is comparatively uglier. It's not a bad-looking game by any means, and Namco definitely used the Nintendo 64's graphics quite well. However, the very flat shading makes it look like an improved port of Ridge Racer Revolution more than it does a game that came out in the same year as Ridge Racer 5 and after Ridge Racer Type 4. It still looks good, but not as good as Type 4. That's why Type 4 gets a point. While both the PlayStation 1 and Nintendo 64 versions of Hot Wheels Turbo Racing aren't exactly lookers, the PlayStation 1's sharper textures are contrasted with the lower draw distance the system also has, even though the PS1 version has more tracks and far more music of far higher quality. Due to all of these factors in this special case, as the games are so similar, I think it's fair to give the PS1 version a point here, because, well, the draw distance is shorter, it just looks better. While the Nintendo 64 version of V-Rally did come out in 1999, at that point, Need for Speed V-Rally 2 was already released on the PlayStation 1. V-Rally's graphics aren't quite bad, and the port to the Nintendo 64 was well done, but when you compare it to the rich and detailed world of V-Rally 2, and the more detailed vehicles, the fact they have a damage model, it's honestly weird why V-Rally 2 wasn't ported to the Nintendo 64 instead of V-Rally. Maybe developing for one system was harder or something, I don't know. Need for Speed High Stakes released a year before Cruis'n Exotica. While it does look really nice, its frame rate can often dip into the low 20s. Even so, its world is rich in color, has tons of vehicles on the road, and overall, it just looks nice, even with some frame rate issues. Exotica goes for a much more neon style. In some ways, it feels like a step back from World, or more like a stagnation, and because of that, I don't really have that much to say here. Racing Lagoon and Top Gear Rally 2, released in the same year, And while they're basically incomparable, let's compare them anyways. The Squaresoft Japanese exclusive racing RPG, which has an English translation by the way, looks really fucking nice. I'd argue it even looks better than some of Polyphony's own offerings in Gran Turismo. Top Gear Rally 2 goes for a far more natural theme, and while the weather does make the colors look a little mute, the game still looks pretty solid with proper road geometry and some really interesting environments. Far better than the last Top Gear Rally at least. Gran Turismo 2 released a year before Stunt Racer. GT2 is graphically very similar to GT1. You know, the tracks have quite a bit of detail in them, the foliage is well done, the particle effects are nice, and the game overall just looks plainly good. Stunt Racer 64 also looks good, but in a different way. While the game does feel a bit like you're on shrooms, the textures are nice, the lighting is nice, the entire game just looks nice. It's good. The PlayStation 1 and Nintendo 64 versions of NASCAR 2000 are, well, let's get into it. The draw distance for the surrounding objects around the track aren't that good in either version. The difference is that the PlayStation 1 version just pops them into existence, while on the Nintendo 64 there's a nice little fade-in. Sadly, where the Nintendo 64 version falters is in an area where I feel it matters far more. On the track itself, and the grass surrounding it, which looks far more flat and low resolution, especially when you compare it to the far more detailed road on the PlayStation 1 version. I just have to give a point here to the PS1 version, because as nice as the fade-in effect is, the road is just far more important. Our final two games are Colin Mcrae Rally 2 and Rally Challenge 2000, both games released in the year 2000. I had the Mcrae 2 game on PC, and the PS1 version doesn't hold up graphically that well, but it still looks really nice. The road is nice, the environments are very detailed, the car is nice, everything is just nice, again. Rally Challenge 2000 has some pretty decent looking cars, and its environments range from barely being there to actually looking pretty nice. The main issue of this game is the particle effect system, and basically, whenever there's too much dust on screen, the frame rate just tanks. From the games that I've directly compared, the PS1 has 5 points, while the Nintendo 64 has 1. This is because from the games that I've directly compared with each other, most of the time, the PS1 version was better for a variety of reasons, but both libraries still have a pretty decent library of actually enjoyable racing games. If you want my favorites, on the Nintendo 64, I really enjoyed Ridge Racer 64, WipEout 64, GT 64 Championship Edition, Hot Wheels Turbo Racing, Stunt Racer 64, and Rally Challenge 2000. On the PS1, I liked them all, genuinely. On the Nintendo 64, most of them weren't bad, but they just didn't hit the same. And that's sort of the issue here. If I compared 5 racing games in each system, or 10, you would probably see a far different roundup. 10 PS1 games I enjoyed, and 6 Nintendo 64 games I enjoyed, and 4 I still thought were decent. But due to the size of the Nintendo 64's library, we really end up reaching for games we otherwise really wouldn't be reaching for, and that's the issue. The library is just small. I played 15 out of the 65 Nintendo 64 racing games, which is around 26%. Considering there are 324 PS1 racing games, to get around the same percentage point, we would need to play 84 PS1 racing games to hit the same amount of the mid that we came across in the Nintendo 64 library. So you could imagine how, during the 90s, the variety of top-tier racing games Nintendo 64 owners had access to was far lower than PS1 owners, which is why Nintendo 64 owners often owned games of multiple genres, even if they maybe weren't the biggest fans of them. It's because that was what was available. Meanwhile, PS1 owners could just buy a ton of games in the same genre, because far more games existed. It's definitely interesting. Graphically, I mean, you saw the games. The N64 had issues with fill rate, which is why Rally Challenge 2000 lagged during dusty sections, and the blurry graphics really didn't age the best. Meanwhile, the jaggies present in PS1 games also didn't age the best, though this time due to texture warping. However, the sharpness definitely helps. I personally prefer how PS1 games looked, though overall, I feel almost every single PS1 game and some Nintendo 64 games could have definitely benefited from a flat-shaded vertex color LOD system just to make the world seem more cohesive. Either way, that's about all I have for today, so see you next time.